I'm right in the middle of our nut tree planting season. It's just coming into spring, so I'm trying to get them in before they get too developed. I've done the chestnuts, I've still got the hazels to do, but I thought this was a good point to talk about the layout of where I got the trees in, because once I put the hazels in as well, they've got similar tree guards, won't be able to see a thing, you know, it'll just be a massive tree guards. So I've put three, in terms of positioning, north is right behind me, south is in that direction. Going uphill from me here is an entire chicken forest. So it's probably a good half an acre plocked, maybe, but maybe a bit more than that, getting on 3/4 of an acre by the time, yeah, easily 3/4 of an acre of multi-species food forest. This is one of the big overstory species, the chestnut. Now we've got at the back end, just at the, you see where the fence line is, that's where we've got our outer skin of shelter belt. That's a double row of alder. They're very young at the moment, they'll be coming up in the next couple of years. Alder's very aggressive growing through grasses, it does really well with grass competition. So that's coming up as the shelter belt on the northern side. That's got an understory of all sorts of things as well that went in at a similar sort of time. There's many layers of shelter belt planting, we've done a load of videos on it. The conifer trees that you can see are almost all just nurse crop. They're not going to be in there for very long. They'll get used for other purposes. They're not in there for very long. They'll be another 10 years maybe and they'll be phased out. Inside that we've got the more productive stuff, and there'll be a multi-height food forest system in here. So the chestnut will be the overstory, but here for example that is a josterberry that's just coming into its first year from cutting. We've got that's another josterberry. That's a bad example. Here's a good one. Right, so this tree here is a morello cherry, theoretically a sour cherry. I think they're beautiful to eat just out of hand. I think they're a really good eating cherry. It's on a semi-dwarfing rootstock, so it'll be an understory underneath the chestnuts. It does crop fairly reliably in that sort of shade, the morello cherry. So we'll get a crop out of it underneath the chestnuts. We've got other species coming in here as well, mostly hazel. We'll show that afterwards. These chestnuts are planted relatively close together. There's maybe three main rows. There's one runs in front of me here, the other row is just in front of the camera, and the third row runs again in this line all the way across. You can see there's another morello cherry tree here as an understory. And these can grow out into their full height and they'll be really well. But if the chestnuts did that, they're going to be in severe competition with each other. You know, these are big, climax canopy tree species. They're huge. What's going to happen is some of them are going to die. We're not going to give them a great deal of love. So what's going to happen is they're not all going to survive, basically. We're not going to give them a huge amount of love. Those that need a lot of babying along are just going to fail, and that's fine. They're not suitable for this site. The survivors will be the ones that can cope with the intermittent droughts that we get every other year now, that can cope with 60, 70 mile an hour winds for 3 days straight, that can cope with 20 hours of intense sun, that can cope with Caithness effectively. You know, we're very far north here. This is an extreme environment and we need trees that can cope with it. So instead of buying select cultivars and then seeing which ones of them survive, we plant in bulk, we plant en masse, and then we use the survivors. Of those survivors, and they won't all remain in nice neat rows, of course, that isn't our objective. This is just for easy management early on so we can see what's what and it's easier to deal with it all. And the rows themselves are reasonably far apart, so we'll come to that in a bit. Some of them will just die, and then of the survivors, some of them will bear nut crops relatively quickly. Those are the ones that we want. Those that look particularly well and those that bear nuts early. So ones that look a bit ill, that's not a big deal. We can just coppice them. They'll regenerate as firewood, and those ones then become pole wood fuel. Chestnut wood is really good. It's very rot resistant. It lasts a really long time. Makes excellent posts. It makes really good fuel. It's beautiful. So you can never have too much of it. Because it grows in the coppices very readily, we can just keep that as an understory that we harvest out for poles and a little bit of understory. Hazel will do the same, which will be coming in next. But of the ones that we let go, they'll be the ones that are the nut producing ones. And because the only chestnuts, I mean, there's none within easily 50, 60 miles. Actually, I know of a couple up the road, but they actually came from our, the same place that ours, because, I gave them to them. So all the chestnuts here are going to be ours. So they're all going to be basically, our, improved genetics survivors breeding against each other, so then we can take those nuts and then we can breed them on for another generation and get really good productive nut varieties up here. So this is the main block of them, of all the chestnuts. There's an understory as well across the back of it. Just inside the shelter belt, we've got a load of rootstocks that have gone in. So we've got apple, which was Antonovka apple, and there's also some of that dotted through all of this as well. Those are in because as a rootstock, Antonovka is an amazing apple. We've used a lot of it, but these in particular down here, we can regraft to them, and because it's such a cold hardy variety, those Antonovka apple rootstocks will confer some of that resistance, some of that cold resistance to whatever we put to it. So we can plant apple varieties that are pushing it a little bit, and they'll be tougher, more resistant to extreme cold. Not that we get much of that these days, but we're still going to get the odd brutal winter. That's just the nature of climate change. It's going to happen now and again. So it gives us a certain amount of resilience there, and we can also do the same thing to the wild pear rootstocks that we've gone in. So we've got a multi-species fruit forest. So some of the apple and the pear, and perhaps even the odd chestnut, could be transplanted and moved out as well. If there's just two of them that are really good that are next to each other, we can make a decision at that point and we can move them out. So we've got basically a breeding system for really good chestnuts in amongst a mixed food forest that will be, and we've also got as an understory a lot of this. This is dwarf comfrey. It's just ready for me dividing up now. That'll be pretty much at least 60–70% of the food forest. We'll have this as an understory, and we'll pulse the chickens through it in a rotational grazing system. So you can see what they're going to be eating. Food right in from the trees. Anything that's got bugs or gets damaged, or a major storm, or the June drop, or any of those phenomena, anything that hits the ground gets turned into amazing meat, eggs, more chickens, feathers, and so on. The ground cover meets their needs as well. The whole point is to create a input-free chicken system that also meets our needs with huge amounts of food raining from the sky. So, which brings me to why chestnuts. Chestnuts are one of the most important nuts in Europe. They're extraordinary. They're basically pure carbohydrate. It's like grain from a tree. It's like potatoes that you don't need to plant. It's like grain that you don't need to plough for. Ploughing causes huge amounts of damage. Especially as more people are transitioning to a plant-based diet, nut crops become increasingly important because they are potentially animal-free fats, oils, carbohydrates that don't have the negative associations of extensive grain production, which of course is causing massive erosion. Grain production is a massively problematic crop. Simply is. The nut crops that can replace them, it's what we need to transition over to, basically. There's a lot of work being done on this. It's not something that I've made up. This is well-established science. Chestnuts are incredible. We need more of them. So we're breeding ones specifically for this environment because they're so crucial. I think a mature chestnut tree produces something about, I think, 25, hang on, what's the numbers? There we go, yeah, 25 to 50 kilo of chestnuts per year. And that's the saleable product. And with chestnuts, there's a very thin skin. Most of it is the nut itself, the meat inside it. So in terms of saleable product, that's all very interesting. Our use is for using it directly as nuts right here on site as a staple food crop, because you can grow all sorts of nice stuff on trees, really nice food forest species and all the rest of it. You still need bulk calories, you still need your fats, you still need your proteins, and you still need your carbohydrates. These are the carbohydrates that no matter what can happen, we can have potato blight, we can have a particularly bad year, all the rest of it, we should still have some sort of nut crops. You still don't want to rely entirely on one crop, of course, but still. 25 to 50 kilo of carbohydrate per tree per year in perpetuity. And because you can coppice these and you can regenerate them from the rootstock, you can keep doing that for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Thousands in the case of chestnut. They're an amazing tree. So yeah, we've got this big block square of them here. I'll show you, as we put the hazels in, I'll go and show you exactly where else they've gone. We've also got a big strip of hazels that go all the way across the bottom of the field. So again, just inside the shelter belt. So as the shelter belt trees come up, which are older, and the chestnuts come up, they're relatively close to each other. So we've got the nitrogen fixation effect of the alder. We'll be sharing that with the chestnuts, so we'll get good, strong growth from the chestnuts. We can coppice the alder if it starts to choke out the chestnut in any way. We've got options there because they all coppice very readily, so we can cut away without worrying about, you know, causing a massive amount of damage. It's effectively the inner skin of the northern side of the northernmost shelter belt, so it's still a relatively exposed spot at the minute, but it won't be forever. As the trees come up, it'll get a lot more sheltered and everything gets a chance to do its thing. So at the moment, every single white tree guard that you see, these are these new ones that we started using. They're like little mini greenhouses, so we should get, you know, really good growth. They'll be on for a couple of years and then we'll take them off. They're not on here for long, and they'll get used into other projects and eventually get recycled again. We try and minimize plastic use, but realistically we need vole protection here, otherwise we'd just be wasting a huge amount of trees, you know, just for them to get eaten. So it's a compromise, but it's one we've had to make. There's easily 300 or 400 chestnut gone in. I also have some that were still a little bit small that I kept in the tray that I can put in a few years, but I'll dot them around the place as feature trees rather than as a part of this big block planting. So yeah, that's the chestnut in. Now it's the hazel. Now for every single chestnut, there'll probably be 4 or 5 hazels. They'll be the understory tree beneath the canopy of what will be chestnut trees here. They will go, so for example, there's the first row of chestnut, here's the second row of chestnut. I'm going to put a double row of hazel through here. I'm going to put a double row of hazel again through this gap here. So in terms of, if we look at this block and we call it, I don't know, we'll call it a quarter, it isn't quarter of an acre, but for the sake of argument, we'll call it quarter of an acre. We've got a quarter of an acre of chestnuts, but we've also on the same land, we've got a quarter of an acre of hazels. Now the hazels aren't going to be as productive as if they were out on open land with full sun exposure, but they will still be somewhat productive. So we've still got a net gain overall, as well as a huge amount more biomass, and we'll do the same thing with the hazels. Those that do well in our environment and thrive, and those that produce nuts, are the ones that we're going to keep. The others, we'll either dig them out or we'll perhaps switch them over to coppicing for fuel wood as well, because again, hugely productive coppice species. And the wildlife benefits of having that sort of dappled coppice are huge, as well as it just feels like a natural woodland. It gives it's a nice feel to it. You can tell it's a functioning ecosystem. So yeah, it's time to get going with the hazels. So that's the hazel in as well. So you can see the original 3 rows are still pretty much still in place, but where the original row of chestnut was, now I've got 2 rows of hazel just to the south side of it. So it's a lower shrubbier form of tree. So you'll have an overstory of chestnut, lower story of hazel. And the same is duplicated here. Again, row of chestnut, 2 rows of hazel. But here we've got a row of chestnut, we've got 2 rows of hazel, and then in some places we've got 3. And on the very southernmost side of it, I've got another row of hazel, but there's only 6 of these. These are ones that I bought as special ready stratified seed from a good nutting cultivar, one that was a high production ones. And they're just here purely for stud genetics, just so that we got some high yielding genetics going into the lines that we're going to be producing from these. So that is, I didn't count them. I don't know how many hundreds of hazels, but also along the boundary right down into that corner at the same sort of spacing as we've got here, very densely planted, in fact a bit closer. We've got them running all the way down to the bottom corner and then all the way up that other side of that field and then right across the top. I'll do a video on the hazel system or the entire shelter belt system some point in the next couple of weeks, but that is all the hazels in. So that is our last big tree planting really. From this it's into doing smaller batches of stuff. We'll be filming that as well of course, but this was a lot of work. This was, even with doing them fairly quickly, you know, rapid turnover, this was a couple of days of work getting all the hazels in. But it's a major piece of infrastructure that cost us very little because we bred it ourselves and should be producing food and firewood for generations.